So, welcome back, everybody, after the break. I hope you're still keeping sufficiently cool. Um, I'm delighted now to welcome Aileen Reid, who is going to be talking with Dan McGonigal. Um, Dan, I want to introduce, because he has the most wonderful job title. He is Head of International Research Programs in the International Biodiversity and Climate Directorate at the UK Government's Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Um, that's almost an essay for a job title. Dan, it's very good to see you. I'm sure we're going to have an extremely interesting conversation, or hear a really interesting conversation. So let me hand over to you, Dan, to introduce Aileen.
Well, thanks very much, Nigel, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part today. Very exciting. It's very warm in the UK here today, as you mentioned. So welcome, Aileen. Aileen is Associate Professor of Educational Research Methodology in the Information Library and Research Services Department, and is a Senior Fellow of the Office of Assessment, Evaluation and Research Services at UNC Gainsborough, which is a job title about as long as mine, I think. So welcome, Aileen. It's great to have you here today. What we want to do is to cover some of your experiences of working on policy evaluation in the US. So perhaps we could start off. It'd be great if you'd just be able to introduce yourself maybe a little bit more. What's been your journey into evaluation, and how have you got started in this area?
Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this conference. I want to just greet everyone. While it's end of the day for you, it's the beginning of the day for us. So hopefully I'm fresh enough to keep you energized. I'm going to give you a really kind of roundabout story in terms of my start in evaluation, but I think it's important to understand that in terms of our conversation as we talk about like the United States context, as we talk about policy, as we talk about complexity and systems evaluation today. And I was thankful to be on with my colleague, Bianca. She and I work in the same spaces. We're part of a community of practice together. So I'm going to try not to overlap a lot with what she said, but there's still going to be lots of overlap. But so by way of just introducing myself, I am Afro-Caribbean, able-bodied woman of faith. I am a United States citizen, but I'm also a first-generation college student. I'm an immigrant. I'm a mom. I'm a wife, a friend, a colleague, and a world traveler. I describe myself as an advocate and a change agent. And so Dan has already introduced my professional bio in terms of what I do professionally and all of the titles, but these are also professional identities that I carry with me. They're with me all the time. And so you would look at me and you would see some visible identities like my gender or my skin color, my vernacular. I grew up in New York City. The Caribbean accent comes out when I'm with my family, but you know, if you're from a different context and you're listening carefully, you hear all kinds of accents. And so with these identities, sometimes I'm judged, sometimes positively and negatively by these identities, but then others are not so visible, but they're still always with me and they shape who I am. And so when I think about, I was born in Guyana, South America. It's the only English-speaking country in South America, located along the Atlantic Ocean. And we refer to ourselves as Caribbean because of our food and culture. It's closer to Caribbean islands like Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica and many of the other Caribbean islands. But we're also part of the African diaspora brought to the Americas via the Atlantic slave trade, primarily originating from West Africa. And so in about 1983, my family immigrated to the United States and we settled in New York City, specifically Harlem. If you've ever heard about Harlem, Manhattan, I pretty much grew up in the city of New York. And when I was in sixth grade, my elementary teacher recommended that I push past the boundaries of what is expected of us growing up in Harlem in terms of my next school. So in New York, we call it junior high school. In some places, they call it middle school. And she really, that decision, right, kind of really changed the trajectory of my life. It pushed me outside of my school zone. And I know this is a lot of background, but it really is going to really help inform the conversation for you to get insight into who I am and my thinking and the work that I do and why I do it in a particular way. And so that advanced me and gave me exposure to science and math, which eventually took me to my undergraduate university, Duke University, which is located in North Carolina, where I'm currently working. My daughter is also a rising junior at Duke, so I'm happy for that legacy. And so it was at Duke that I obtained a degree in public policy studies. But as you can imagine, I don't know if you know a lot about the US South, it's hugely different from the North, right? Like I grew up in a totally urban context, city life, and then we get to the South and I have to deal with issues of race and racism in ways I had never dealt with them growing up in New York City, where New York City were pretty much of a melting pot. And I get to Duke University, and in my first semester, I am called the ugly N-word. This is early 1990s. And so that begins to shape who I am. And, you know, this is a lot of information. You're wondering like why I'm putting that out there, because it really, it keeps me humbled and centered and focused on the work that I do. And so while Duke was sort of that first place, and I love Duke University, so don't let this, kind of change your image, but it's the reality. So it's the place that I really experienced being a person of color in America, but it's also the place that introduced me to evaluation, right? And in many ways, the research agenda that I am pursuing today. And so I call myself an accidental evaluator because I went to university to study, to become a doctor, to become a physician of some kind. And along the line, I determined that that wasn't the route for me. I call myself a STEM dropout, STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, because I didn't know I didn't know that I needed the right supports. I didn't know about the hidden curricula. Bianca mentioned that earlier. I didn't know how to ask for help and where to find it. And so, like, I encountered this culture shock in so many different dimensions that really disoriented me. And I changed majors. And so I found my way to public policy. And I'm coming to evaluation now. And a wonderful professor who helped me pursue my interest in international development. And he gave me the opportunity to do an internship in Southern Africa to evaluate a children in war program. This was about the sophomore year of college. And I was able for 3 months to live and work in the refugee camps, which at the time were housing people who were displaced from the war in Mozambique. And so I didn't know that I was really, like, I knew evaluation wasn't formally taught, but I knew I was evaluating. I didn't necessarily have criteria. I just was, he kind of just like, go and evaluate this program. And so that's really when it started for me. I came back after that experience, and I will say, like, fun fact, while being in the refugee camp, Princess Diana, I'm really dating myself, came through to visit the camps, and I was able to like serve her tea. So like that was an amazing experience, and really kind of a hallmark really of my time in Africa. And so I came back and pursued a master's of public administration, focused on health policy and management because of what I had seen in the camps, also centering my own experiences growing up in the city. And then eventually got a job at New York University where I had done my master's to do, because of my background in health policy, to do evaluation work. And again, I didn't have a lot of training. It was because of my contextual background in terms of studying health policy and management, having a public policy degree, that really brought me into evaluation formally. I was hired to do the qualitative portion, to manage the project. And it was a huge project funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that looked at the health and social welfare of children across 5 U.S. cities, children and youth across 5 U.S. cities. And Bianca spoke about this earlier. This is this is 1999, 2000, and the shift where foundations are beginning to really influence policy making and decision. And so our evaluation worked with city governments across these 5 U.S. cities to really evaluate how they were addressing the health and social outcome and well-being of students. And so along the lines, I've learned that my experiences matter, like my lived experience, my identities, my experiences as a cultural being really has influenced and informed how I practice evaluation and how I show up in the spaces that I do work. And I've been able to dialogue really openly about issues of like race and power, inequity, diversity, culture, and context, really with an eye towards justice in our society, which I know it's going to spin us in a different way, but really, I took you through all of that history because it has shaped who I am, and it's still pretty important for me to show up in my authentic self in the work that I do. And so when I think about the lessons that I've learned over the past 20 something years on evaluation, is that people are at the center of this work. And so when I teach my courses, I tell my students, depending on the day, evaluation is about like 20% technical and 80% interpersonal. And that's argued, but in terms of looking at it from like a human-centered or people-centered approach, because we try to say we evaluate programs, but it's really people that are impacted by the programs that we're evaluating. And so that's kind of the lens. And then the other lens, thinking about the values, right, that I bring, as well as the values that are inherent in programs and stakeholders and all of those things. And so it gives me an opportunity to be educative. So that was a huge, long answer and introduction, but I hope it kind of sets the tone for how I'll answer some of the other questions that you may pose today.
That's a really fascinating starting off point, and loads of directions we could potentially go in there. I'm really intrigued by what you were saying about how you sort of bring your lived experience, how you bring your sense of identity and kind of sense of authenticness, I guess, into your approach to evaluation. I think there's two areas that I'd be really keen to sort of explore. I think first is how does that interact with the more academic side of or more process side of evaluation, and how do you bring those two things together? The really human centric and the more kind of theoretical. And then secondly, I'm really intrigued to understand a bit more about the kind of context in the US in particular, and how that sort of approach fits into when you're working with I don't know, some of your stakeholder groups, government, or whatever. How do those sorts of approaches go down? And are these sorts of approaches becoming more mainstream?
Good question. So the academic side. So you're going to have to kind of refresh me on the second question. I'm holding it in my head, but
okay,
to help me be more targeted. So, so the academic side, I think the last 10 to 15 years in the United States have been really transformative, particularly as a scholar of color, as a professor of color. The political climate, I would say, I went back to, so I've had a master's, and then part of my other life is my other life. I'm also a minister, like pastor of churches. And so we've lived in Canada, we lived in Montreal. And so I've really had, like, in addition to being an immigrant, I've had the opportunity to live outside the United States for a little while and do that kind of work. And so when I came back to finish up my doctoral degree, it was during the time when the United States was going through like another wave. This was 2015. We're dealing with all of the racial issues. We're dealing with violence. We're dealing with all of these things. The Trump administration, that was during the Obama years, and then we're starting with the Trump administration, and the United States is just erupting, like racially and socially, and we're like, me as in the field, like I already have all these lived experiences. I had worked outside the United States, and we're talking about, well, how does this impact who we are? Like, what is our responsibility as evaluators of color? The field of evaluation in the United States started to look at issues of social justice. When we look at our like conference team, the American Evaluation Association, more emphasis on justice, culturally responsive evaluation, responsive social justice oriented approaches were also starting to emerge. And so as evaluators of color, we are having these conversations that we really need to forefront and center these issues and really utilize frameworks. And so now I'm teaching, I'm in the classroom, and the majority of my students, UNC Greensboro attracts lots of international students. So I have students from all over the world. And we're always having these conversations, because if we don't know who we are, if we're not kind of cognizant of what identities we bring into our evaluation context, we're really actually doing a disservice to the evaluation. And it's not even just an awareness, but really being able to understand our influence. And we talk about value neutrality in evaluation, right? Like, and really just owning who we are in that context. So that's kind of like the beginning point of how that shows up in my teaching, in my mentoring, and continuing to replicate and put forward evaluators who can operate in like this complicated, complex world that we live in. And I'm just speaking from the US context, but my students are also coming from other complex systems and nations where race and ethnicity and power and privilege and all these things are like, you can't disassociate them from policy. You can't disassociate them from the evaluation work that we do. So that's the short answer to your first question. The second question, remind me, how does it show up in the work that I do?
Yeah, I think so. I'm interested in sort of flipping it from the perspective of people who are running the programs that you're evaluating.
Mm-hmm.
And what are their expectations, and how do the sorts of approaches that you're taking align with the kind of mainstream for those sorts of evaluations?
So Bianca mentioned this a little bit earlier. I evaluate a lot of STEM education programs. So I'm more on a local level that trickles up in some ways to policy, but I don't evaluate like directly government programs in that sense. And so one of the things that I do, so the whole framing that I just did for you, I do that with the stakeholders that I work with, right? And so that initially there's a contract. And when I say contract, it's an informal, this is what you're getting. This is the lens that I'm bringing to the evaluation, because prior to 2025, January, when there was a dismantling of diversity, equity initiative, like social justice, all of the things that the world has been watching the US kind of fall apart, those were priorities, right? Like the National Science Foundation, that's the primary funding agency that funds lots of the work that I do. Those, looking at issues of equity were top concerns, right? Broadening participation, where we focused on disadvantage at various levels, economic disability, marginalized communities, and so forth. So that was welcomed, right? And that was part of the lens that was expected of evaluators. And so culturally responsive approaches, transformative approaches, social justice oriented approaches, equity centered approaches were welcomed from a National Science Foundation point of view. Stakeholders that I work with in the STEM fields, what I have learned coming back, working with them, many were not necessarily as familiar with evaluation in the sense, and I think Bianca mentioned this earlier, evaluation goes by different names, people's understanding. So program evaluation. And so it was an opportunity for me to be educative in terms of how can evaluation serve you, how it can bring value rather than judging your program, but how can I, as an evaluator, me bringing my team in, how can it add value to your program? So like having these conversations, being able to center and I call it like being a critical friend, to really engage with you about your program in a way that it's meaningful and it really drives decision making, rather than it's me coming in, collecting data and having a value judgment and sending that off to the National Science Foundation. I hope that's clear. I'm trying to be conscious of time.
Yeah, no, I think it is. Do you see evidence that evaluation is acted on?
Yes, I do. I do because, and again, I'm going to use the National Science Foundation's framework because programs are evaluated at different levels, right? So the National Science Foundation, for programs that are funded, they do a site visit, a reverse site visit. So they will bring an evaluation team to evaluate programs annually, particularly programs that are funded at like high levels of like $20 million. I evaluate several of those. So they're annual site visits. So there's an evaluation team. And then there is also a mandate that evaluation, and Bianca mentioned this, that evaluation has to be part of the framework, right? So, and it can be in the form of myself, like an external evaluator, or they can have an advisory board or some kind of framework. And so evaluation is used because we have to submit the reports. And let's say in the site visits, the program officers are looking at the evaluation reports, right? When I sit on review panels, I'm invited as an evaluator to ensure that there's a built-in evaluation component. And then the teams also use it. They're also often responsive to the feedback I give, whether it's written or informal. So from a project-specific level, I see it there. And then on a national, federal, state policy level, I think research drives, well, we're hopeful it continues to drive evaluation work. Evidence continues to drive policy decision making at higher levels.
Do you find that there are certain types of evidence that land better than others, that have more impact in terms of decision making?
Yes, quantitative, right? Like this is the argument. And again, I tell Bianca, I'm like, we're going to overlap a lot, but um, the positivist approach, right? Like the desire for experimental. So like the Institute for Education Sciences, Bianca was hinting at this with the What's Work Clearinghouse that really is, looking at rigorous evidence, right? So like on certain levels, and that's Department of Education, I'm talking about that funding, like it's looking at like, like the gold standard was the RCT, the randomized controlled trials, quasi-experimental designs, right? Like, so there's like the debate or tensions about the hierarchy of what's considered rigorous evidence, right? And so I think from a policy perspective, quantitative measures are still the gold standard. Quantitative, sorry. But I do think now there's a push, particularly from the field of evaluation, from those of us who are culturally responsive evaluators. And again, we're at a turning point trying to figure out, well, where do we go from here given the political climate? But pushing that, like the lived experiences have to also tell the story, because numbers alone, right? Like numbers don't speak for themselves. They have to be interpreted, and they are good, right? We're not arguing they're not good, but we're also saying that there needs to be mixed methods incorporated into evaluations, because we also need to hear the voices of those who are being impacted by evaluation, particularly when we're talking about marginalized communities. And there are these huge social programs or educational programs that are really impacting communities, right? People, again, going back to the humanness of evaluation.
Really interesting. I'm thinking about my own perspective. I work in the UK government on environmental policy and providing scientific evidence and sometimes evaluation evidence into decision making there. And I think what I'm seeing is increasing appetite for kind of engaging with the complexity of the systems that we're working on.
Absolutely.
Really keen to hear a little bit about what that looks like from your side in terms of whether there's appetite to look at complexity, how you help people in effect make sense of what is, when you're working on these social systems in effect, it's really complicated, and it's very easy to come up with very simplistic stories about, well, if we intervene here, then this is going to happen, but actually you've got 15 other things that are affecting the same outcome. But
yeah, I think the US system is probably one of the complicated ones, and I'm not saying that because we're special, but because we have to deal with the history of race and racism in the United States and structural inequities. And so when we think about it from a complexity and a systems perspective, we have to get to like the root causes of why our educational system is the way it is, and why educational policies exist the way they do, which is connected to health and social and environmental, right? And like, so if you're thinking about it from a holistic systems perspective, we've got to go really deep and look and be able to own the foundations of this nation and the impact it has played. And so I think the world has watched that in the last year, that we still have a way to go. I'm trying to be diplomatic, right? Like, I think the progress that had been made, we've taken a couple of steps backwards. And so we have to figure out, how do we continue to keep pushing forward, keep centering these issues, addressing them in a way that, I don't know, it's just a difficult period in the US history right now. Paul, I see you here. I know I've
Well,
just been like chatting away.
we quietly added another 5 minutes to your conversation in the background there because it was going quite deep in certain areas. I didn't want to cut you off. But as we have in the other sessions, the 20 or 30 people online, if I think about what questions you might want to raise and pop those in the box. And I don't know if you were here for the last session, Lena, whether you talked. We'll actually leave 1 minute of quiet. People think about it, so they're not trying to think of a question while somebody's talking over it. So enjoy a minute of quiet. I'm going to take the liberty of dropping a question in while others think about it. Aileen, you were talking in the last couple of minutes about the depth you have to dig down and back in the United States to understand why some of your socioeconomic systems are the way they are. It's not what's happened in the last 3 years or the last policy cycle. It's got roots going back 20, 30, 40, 50 years and
Hundreds.
and hundreds of years. In terms of the systemic inequities and that kind of thing. And that's true in different ways in different countries, but there's a particular tone to it in America. How do you go into that conversation and bring that into the topic you're discussing without that becoming the entire conversation, if you like? Because there's so much of it. I know in conversations I have with Americans. How do you both go into the depth and the complexity, but also remain in the conversation and the effect you're actually trying to assess the change to a policy? Do you have a way you think about that process of going deep and then coming back up again?
I think in academia, and this is just my thought, I think in academia, and which is pretty much where I operate. So I'll start there, right? So I do think that there is a clear understanding in academia and acceptance that structural inequities exist. I think as scholars and researchers, we know the research, we understand the evidence, and so there is a large scale commitment to addressing these evidence, these concerns, or these problems. In STEM, looking to bring in more underserved groups, right? Women, people in rural areas, students of color, right? Economically disadvantaged. And so you have a body of scholars and researchers working to address these issues. So it's not difficult in that standpoint. Where it becomes difficult is probably in larger policy context, right?
Federal context or
federal
state
context, where I think the evidence is there, but there's also the tension of what's credible evidence, right? Like, and I know that's like an ongoing conversation, like what's considered evidence. And so it goes back to the last question that Dan asked in terms of, well, what are the preferred methods or methodologies or types of interventions that would generate credible evidence as opposed to appreciating the lived experiences? And so I think that's also part of the conversation. So I don't think people are in denial that structural inequities exist. It's a matter of, do they still exist, or should we shine as much a light on them as some are pushing for versus others? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I think it goes to the stage of, therefore, what question do they decide to ask for
Exactly.
where do they bound it? Can be
Exactly.
Emma, do you want to come on with your question? And while Emma's asking her question, I just want to ask particularly the Europeans who are still on the line, Eileen raised some fairly deep root causes of inequity and how they appear or don't appear in evaluations. I'd be interested in people in the European group who are here, whether you have parallels that you would draw with that in the European context. Emma, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Aileen and Daniel. I've just got a quick question about mixed methods. You mentioned the term.
Mhm.
Is that like primary quants, primary qual, or is there a kind of stereotypical pairing, or are you meaning multiple methods? What were
I think it's
you?
both mixed and
Okay.
multiple, right?
Got
So,
it.
for example, the work that I do, we will pair, basic quant surveys, right? Like those kinds of things with interviews or focus groups. We also do photo voice, right? And so it's probably more multiple methods than it is just mixed, but generally we say mixed, like quant and qual methods complementing each other. Does that
Yeah.
answer your question?
Yes, yeah, it does. Thank you.
No rush of questions from the floor, but let's leave that open. Dan, did you have another channel that I cut you off before you got to a further question that you want to pursue? I have others, but it was your interview, not mine. So another direction you'd like to take us in?
Why don't you go ahead with another one of your questions?
It's a spin-off from where my last comment. In terms of whether it's foundations or government agencies asking for evaluation, to what extent do you see the bounds of what you're asked to evaluate being limited by, some form of agenda? Because we were talking very much in the previous session about the fact that, it's very different in America because your whole layer of civil service is replaced every time a new administration comes in. There are different pressures in terms of, seeing market values. So do you see the evaluation questions you're asked to address being bounded almost to answer a certain question in a certain way or something like that? Is it restricted by the interests of those who are asking?
I think it can be. So, like I said, now in my current work, I work with a lot of programs. When I first started out in evaluation, I talked about foundation work, but then another major evaluation that I did was to evaluate the asthma issues, health issues in New York City. And that was commissioned by New York City Department of Health. And in that sense, and that was like really in the early 2000s where, asthma issues were primarily in communities of color, right?
Yeah.
Like low socioeconomic issues. And I do think there were some parameters around, right? Like I think when a commissioner of evaluation is a government agency, I think there are parameters. There are some kinds of questions that they want answered. And I do think if I go, 20 something years forward now from 2000 to now 2026, I think as an evaluator, I have a little bit more liberty, but again, it's more localized, it's programmed, it's contextually and culturally dependent on what's happening. And so I can frame the questions in that sense. But when I think back to the work that I did early on with policy evaluation, I do think there were some parameters. And I do think we didn't have a chance to really talk about this, but budget also matters, right? Like the funding for this work. If I have again, large initiatives, so something that's funded at a $20 million level has a larger budget for evaluation. So we can explore, we can spend more time in the context versus a project that's smaller with a tighter evaluation budget. You're pretty much limited in what you can explore.
Some of that sounds very familiar from this side of the pond. Martha has a question, and then I was going to ask you, Dan, to reflect back on what we've heard from Eileen as to how much it reflects your experience in a government agency like DEFRA. But Martha, jump in first because you're on the Q&A box.
Hi, Aileen. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, it was a question really that I also wanted to ask Bianca at the end, but these conversations, they fly by so quickly and they're so rich that we just can't squeeze it all in. I was wondering if you could just, apologies if you've already touched on this, I had to take a call from school. So if you've already covered it, just let me know. But I wanted to know from your perspective, what do you think the future of evaluation looks like? And what do we need to be doing to help shape that for the better? So I guess some things that pop into my mind are things like AI and then the sort of democracy angle. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. I think I would say democracy probably is more pressing. I think for us, it's going to take a lot of courage, a lot of advocacy and leadership. Um, and I'm going to say this because I'm speaking out of all of my identities. I think a lot of the structural issues that we've continued to deal with has been scholars of color um, pushing the agenda or pushing advocacy, pushing that forward. And it's not to say others haven't, but we've continued to do this work. We've continued to focus on our communities. We continue to focus on our issues. And so I do think there's going to be, there has to be larger conversations beyond like methodologies and beyond budgets. And again, if we're centering humans, because programs are created for people and they're happening on people. And I do think that we just have to be, we have to be more united, I think, also in our march. And again, and I'm going to say this again, I work in the academic space and I think, and I work with folks who think like me, but I do think that we need to expand the conversation out, right? Like, and just kind of keep pushing that forward. So I think democracy is going to be important. I think AI is definitely changing the game, and we have to keep an eye on it in terms of, does it create further inequities? And I know ethics and equity, those are all conversations. I've written about it. But I do think it's going to continue to change the game in good ways and bad ways. And so we just have to be very thoughtful. And but for me, the long and short of it is, how courageous are we going to be in this work in difficult and complex policy political context? I think really that's what it boils down to, because if we're going to be transformative, then we've got to really address the mental models that are operating in our systems to really begin to see change and transformation.
Thank you.
That's really insightful, Aileen. Dan, I'd love to come back to you. Obviously, not asking you to speak on behalf of DEFRA in any way at all, but you're obviously inside one of the UK agencies and one of the biggest ones in terms of complex evaluations. I'm also conscious I can see several people on the call who I know are in the companies who supply you with evaluations on the DEFRA MEL framework. But if we take the things we've been talking about with Aileen and just before with Bianca, and we go back to someone in your kind of shoe, where you're trying to guide policy, you've got civil servants, senior civil servants beyond you and ministers beyond those, and then you've got evaluation companies, and you've got the British or the European context. How do these conversations, how do they affect how you do your job and how you might commission evaluation or think about it in a policy context?
That's a big question.
You've got 3 minutes to answer it.
I'll nail it in that time. Don't worry. I think it's fascinating listening to Aileen and what she has to say, and it's a quite different operating context, I think, both in terms of the kind of policies that you're working on and some of that operating context as well, which is really interesting to hear about. But some of it is kind of the same in a way, and actually we're looking at, so my work is mostly on the environment, so looking at things like biodiversity loss and climate change and how do we change the way that the land is used both in the UK and overseas in ways which are kind of lead to better social and environmental outcomes, which is is easy to approach from a very technocratic point of view, and to sort of come up with quantitative approaches which come up with optimized solutions, what have you. But actually, these are social problems, and this is about sort of how you understand people, and what are those structural drivers that are causing people to interact with the environment in the way that they do. And some of those very, very deep rooted and go back, hundreds of years in history. So taking that sort of broader, more multidisciplinary kind of approach, I think is exactly where we need to be. I mean, our relationship with evaluation in DEFRA is kind of, we use it in lots of different ways. We kind of do evaluations ourselves. We commission evaluations. A lot of my work is about commissioning research and then evaluating that research to make sure we're sort of funding the right things in the right places as well. So it can be a bit sort of we're looking at sort of layers of evidence on top of each other, I think, in some cases. But then, what are the things that we need in order to change the way that we approach these problems? Are we one of the things I often think is sometimes, we're evaluating a policy or a program or something like that, but actually, are we intervening in the right place in that system? Actually, we've got structural problems that need kind of fundamental systemic approach to sort of the way that you approach them. So I haven't quite nailed it in 3 minutes.
You're not far off, but it is common in my observation in a lot of conversations with CECAN, because we're trying to talk about the complexity rather than ignore it. None of our conversations come to a nice, neatly tied off bow at the end. Oh, bing! There's the answer. 8 out of 10. That's the entire nature of it. It's exploratory, and then you try and say, well, how do we actually deal with this in the real world with all of these different complex pressures? So thank you so much, Aileen and Daniel, for your conversation there. And I'm going to disappear now and hand you back to Nigel for the close of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Paul for closing that conversation, which could, as he says, continue almost indefinitely. But we have to come to an end. And I'm supposed to summarize what we've heard today. I think that's an utterly impossible task. I'm going to say a few words, but I'm not going to do a competent job, I'm afraid, because I don't think anybody can. It was fascinating to hear these different perspectives from Europe, from America. I think you'll agree that there was an incredible amount of experience and wisdom on show today. And that hopefully we've all learned a great deal from that. It's difficult, as I say, to do justice in a few summary words, but I did make note of a few what I'll call gems from the conversation that stood out for me. We started off with Peter van der Knap talking to us, and he was primarily talking from his experience in the Netherlands, although he's also the president of the European Evaluation Society. And one of the things that he said about the Netherlands that I thought was really interesting was that the Ministry of Finance there mandates evaluation of every strategic spending item every 4 to 7 years, and has been doing so for 25 years. I think that one would think that, therefore, that evaluation is a top priority in the Netherlands, and sort of Shangri-La as far as evaluation is concerned. But he also pointed out that there were some downsides to this that we need to remember. That, for example, a mandatory cycle can make evaluation feel much more like a compliance chore, with defense of existing programs prioritized over any learning. And he went on to say that a phrase that I thought was particularly interesting, that he found that there were people or organizations that took a learning approach to avoid accountability, misusing the learning evaluation language to dodge accountability findings. I hope that we won't be inheriting that from the Dutch system, although I fear we might be. We moved on to hear from May Pettigrew, and much of her experience that she talked about was of evaluation in the European Commission. And amongst many other observations, I was struck by her statement that evaluation is inherently a political activity, brokering information across hierarchies of power. And that's a statement which sort of in retrospect is kind of obvious, but I think we probably don't take sufficient notice of when we are trying to do our evaluations. And it has all sorts of important implications. She also commented that even at the Commission, where evaluation is institutionally built in as a requirement to their programs, evaluation is still treated as an overhead, a compliance exercise, not a learning tool, in some ways echoing what Peter had said earlier in the day. And her recipe, her recommendation, although it may be hard to carry out, is that the European Commission and other organizations need to adopt systems approaches and foresight built into evaluation designs, not just added afterwards, to move away. And one of the barriers to this was the procurement frameworks that the Commission and indeed other in the UK also use. These procurement structures and frameworks tend to reinforce linear modernist assumptions that are difficult to overcome. In the afternoon, we heard from Bianca Montrose-Moorhead, and again, really interesting comments about the situation in the United States and how it clearly differs from the situation in Europe, although there are common threads. In the United States, evaluation spans federal, state, local, non-profit, foundation, and for-profit sectors, and it feels highly fragmented, resulting from, to some extent anyway, from the free market principles that pervade the US culture. The effect of those principles creates, according to her, a tension. Someone is always commissioning and paying, which shapes what gets asked as well as what gets answered. She also commented that the kind of what works experimentalist frame, as she calls it, that is the use of RCTs, randomized control trials, and quasi-experimental designs, has been the dominant influence since about 2001 and remains very strong. And that creates a tension with ideas of systems thinking and complexity, something that we're very well aware of here in the UK. And one of the things that that CECAN was originally set up to consider. And then finally, we heard from Aileen Reid. I even less wanting to summarize what she said. You've all heard it just now. But a couple of phrases that she mentioned I thought were worth sort of casting into stone. Numbers don't speak for themselves. We also need to hear the voices of those being impacted, was one of her statements, with which I absolutely agree. And but she also emphasized and explained the role of structural inequalities in evaluation. And I thought that perspective was particularly valuable.